In presentation after presentation, the point is made about the concentration of crime and criminality, special concentration, few offenders. Repeatedly, you see the figure 0.5% of the populations where crime is concentrated are criminally involved. Okay, so if we have these high degrees of concentration, why is the problem so intractable in these places? And I ask the question because I think we need to bring in more the relationship between criminality, criminal organizations, and community. Because I think that's the crux of the problem, these relationships, and it is precisely because of the relationship with the community why the relationship, certainly in the case of the Caribbean, the relationship with politicians, as you mentioned, becomes important for politicians and for criminals. The problem of impunity arises from that as well, right? Because police tend to be politically influenced, so you get this web of relationships that makes it more difficult to deal with. I make this point because a lot of the discussion about interventions and programs and so forth have to take into account that complexity.
Okay. Look, first of all, regarding the concentration depends on the type of crime, okay? This map that I show is about violent crime that includes homicides, but includes rape, includes robbery, includes different kind of crime. And this is important. For example, when you separate the different kind of crime, homicide happens in different places than robberies. Robberies happens in another place of the city, especially in downtown areas, in commercial areas, and things like that. The homicides, on the other hand, is different also. There is some kind of, depend of the model that I showed to you about the development of crime. In some part there is this kind of collusion between politicians and criminals and things. Another no, it's not. In another part it's just groups of kids that they are having fun in the worst way, but they are. Well, it's difficult to understand when they become criminals or just using drugs or things. This is important, I think, that to understand each one of these hot spots and what the dynamics of crime that happens in each one. I think that in the case of Brazil, we don't win much mixing all the diversity and under the label of organized crime. It's not true. There is different degrees of organized crime, and there is different degrees of corruption, police corruption in each one of these areas. We have to understand, to spend a lot of time trying to understand, for example, about investigation, about what the police are doing to understand this kind of thing.
So, building a little bit on that question and the response, Claudio, can you talk a little bit then, what is happening now? Because, of course, Brazil a few years ago was seen as a model for the work that it was doing around prevention and the PPs and all of that. And so is the spike now, the increase, due to these contextual factors with corruption and lack of social investment, plus what seems to be an increase in militia activity and other disorganized crime? Or maybe if you could talk a little bit about, from your perspective, what is happening now in the current context that is leading to this increase in violent crime and homicides?
Well, I'm looking for a graph. It's happening different things in Brazil. Now we have the bad news, but there is some good news. And for example, some of good news, even when we talk about Rio de Janeiro have a very positive progress under many, many years. The last 3 years, There is a fiscal crisis. This is important to understand. The crisis in Brazil is a result of our economic crisis, because the states that are responsible for the police, they have not capacity to fund them, and then this is one of the reasons that they lost their capacity to make a neither quote program or policy in the streets or things like. Well, but despite this, we have another state that all the things are going well. For example, São Paulo. São Paulo is really doing a very important, probably one of the most impressive case of the decrease of homicide that I know in Latin America. There is no such an decrease, the 50 until 6 homicides per 100,000 in less than 15 years. And this is a result of continuous work, trying to manage the police, trying to manage data. They're using a lot of data and maps. And this is another part. The other part that they have to do with some municipalities are not in crisis like the federal government or the state level government, because they have not another funds, but they have a more capacity to control the spending of different parts of the state. And this, well, the picture is more complex. No? And for example, in the case of Fica Vivo, this is one of the most old crime prevention programs that have in the country. We have now 15 years. It's very difficult to find a program with 15 years, 20 years in the case of Brazil. Fica Vivo is happening just now. Now it's become a public policy. There is 40 different places in the state of Minas Gerais involved more than 18,000 youth in the program. This is one of the oldest. Well, they have problems with the economic crisis, but it's remaining. And this is one of the reasons that the state of Minas Gerais, for example, is decreasing their homicide rates in the last year.
So I absolutely agree with you. I think what's happened in Sao Paulo is unprecedented, and it's sort of very surprising to me that more attention is not paid, that we don't discuss it more. If there is good research exploring why the decrease was so dramatic, I haven't seen it. I haven't heard about it, so I'd love to know that. One of the things that is so impressive about this presentation is it does something that in this context is essential, which is it talks about both organized and disorganized.
In São Paulo. Well, yeah, there is a lot to do. But a recent paper that an economist did on the Unicamp, they showed that it's impossible to do this, because there is a decrease in all the cities of the states of São Paulo, and he controlled by the cities controlled by the PCC. In São Paulo, there is no correlation between the domain of the PCC and the decrease of homicide. Well, this is one part. The other part is that really the PCC, the kind of organization that this prison organized crime that we have there have, is that they have the control of people that go out of jail. They have a network. And these people commit crimes like robbery, especially the most complex crime, truck robbery, for example. This is directly connected to what happens inside prisons. That is the organized part of the crime. This is crazy. No, the organized part is inside jail. And the outside, and there is a connection between the drugs, for example, that they sell. And I don't know how to, you are writing on a point that is really intriguing for me in the case of São Paulo, because despite the fact that there is a huge decrease in the homicides, the another kind of crime that decrease, especially property crime, is stable, decreasing very flat. And this may be because of this kind of intervention, that the organized crime, especially in the city of São Paulo.
Can I just make one little point? It seems like something, Charles, that you started, but I'm seeing here is there's a whole set of opportunities for research that is quick and easy, just to sort of attack these big questions with sort of rudimentary data. It just seems like there's a lot of opportunities here that haven't been explored. You know, oh, this is the top theory of why this happened. We'll do some simple data analysis, see if we can confirm or explore it. You know, it seems like that many of these questions in the region could be addressed.
The cool part is that I think a lot of people haven't discussed is how interactive some of this research can be. I mean, you could have key stakeholders, major policy makers doing, I mean, in classrooms now, we have these little apps that students can say, I vote for this, or I think this is why, right? And then you have real-time stats come up and say 50% of the kids in my class think that X happened. And then you can actually go out and investigate those issues. And it can be a iterative participatory approach to get buy-in in terms of why we're doing some of this stuff. There's so many cool, I totally agree with you. There's so many cool opportunities.
Yeah, this is something that we should explore more thoroughly.
Yeah.
I was wondering if, I can't recall exactly what was on the slide, but we saw dramatic reduction in homicides in Sao Paulo. I was wondering if that had an impact overall on the national statistics, because the reason why I asked that question, in Trinidad and Tobago, the Port of Spain division accounts for a significant percentage of the homicides. And a couple of years ago, the homicides dropped in Port of Spain by almost 50%, well more than 50%. But nationally, the total numbers remained the same. So I was wondering if you had a similar experience in Brazil, or if overall there was a reduction.
This is important. Probably the line is with the increase of crimes and homicides in Brazil will be different if São Paulo is not there. Because São Paulo is responsible for not increasing so much in the last years. São Paulo and another state, Minas Gerais, is decreasing, Espírito Santo also, and even Rio de Janeiro is decreasing a lot in the last 15 years, 10 years, okay? I think that the problem of the southeast region, Brazil, that is the region that saw the most virtuous experience in crime reduction or crime control, and the worst experience also, but is that in Brazil, security is not a public policy issue. This is a huge problem that we have. It's not an issue that has been under the eyes of the federal government, okay? I don't know, because they think that our constitution says that the state are responsible for the police, and they have a very conservative view about security that, well, the police is under the domain of the government take care of this. No? Well, what happens? In some states, the governors really began to make a public policy. In São Paulo, for example. This is the result of the São Paulo government. In Minas Gerais, Fica Vivo is a public policy by the state of Minas Gerais. In Rio de Janeiro, the UPP's, Unidade de Polícia Pacificadora, was experienced by the state of Rio de Janeiro. It's not a federal law. It's impressive. This is one thing that I can't understand, because we haven't leftist government in the last 20 years in Brazil, and nobody of this left government care about crime safety. They care about giving some instruction about training, but not really putting money or funding some good experience in terms of crime control. This is the result of the some government that did this.
Not just the cynicism on the other side, but we do tend to look at the regions, the Central American region, through a particular lens. I'm speaking from my own experience, that having been there now for off and on for 5 years and then living there for 2 years, I'm amazed how distorted my lens is of how I look at Central America. And it's generally through the lens of what's missing. All I see the minute I get off the plane is what's missing. It's until recently that I've been really shocked to have data that tells me what I haven't been seeing, which is, the things that are working. I do think there is a certain investment, probably at an international level, to see Central America through a lens of this complexity of problems that we can't understand. And I think part of the reason, at least in my case, I've been shocked to see that I don't understand it because I'm looking at it through a very biased lens. In my case, it's the lens of having come from, work in the second largest city in the U.S. with all the resources in the world and a certain expectation. So I think that there's a lens adjustment that, in my case, I think has become necessary. I'm actually hopeful, having been there now, of some of these smaller research projects that will help us understand what is going on, and I'm hopeful that there's more interest on the other side in answering some of these questions. But then again, that's a very biased point of view.
Robin, did you have a question?
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that buzzword sustainability of this level of intervention, and what happens, and what is the role of the municipality of Rio in taking this on and including this in some of their budget assignations over years, so that it can guarantee that this level of reduction maintains.
Well, let me begin with you, because this I think that is an important question, because in the case of Rio de Janeiro, the municipality doesn't care about security. They make the traditional municipal safety, that is to take care of public buildings or some schools, but not on the streets making security. And I think that this is one of the reasons that the results are going so bad in Rio, because if they use the municipal guard, is 5,000 forces, a lot of people, they can get results. But the mayor is a religious guy, he don't like this subject, and it's very difficult to make, okay? And about the difficulty, I agree totally with Cespedes. No, it's about the one thing that I learned in my experience. I have several experiences in different trying to implement projects. Is when you do anything, you get results. Anything, not huge project, not predictive model of policing, or trying to make the most complex system of crime and mapping. No, it's small things you can get results. And this is an important thing, because I have a colleague from medicine, he's a doctor, and he said that it's like the same experience that they have in some poor communities when they put a pipe of clean water in a favela, and you decrease a lot the rate of mortality in this favela, just putting a pipe of clean water. Well, we are doing is to put the pipes of clean waters. Well, you decrease a lot, but should you advance 1% more, you have to move the world. It's another history. But you can get very good results doing these small steps in different places.
Yeah, one more question. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Fascinating presentation. And I'm struggling to put two slides together, and I'm curious about your view on whether it would be a defensible hypothesis or a worthy one to explore. So there was that triangle that showed, the inverted triangle that showed kind of like the pipeline, that you have your total number of homicides, and at the very bottom, the 6% or so that actually get adjudicated. And then there was the map that showed sort of state-involved homicides, like which part of the security apparatus was involved in sort of given crimes, if I understood it correctly. And I'm wondering if assuming the data are available, if longitudinally one could examine those specific sort of metrics in Sao Paulo to see if whether the prevalence of homicide and the drop observed in Sao Paulo has some relationship to sort of state-involved homicide, and almost as if state crime or state involved homicide is part of this sort of epidemiology of homicide, where it's like state participation or involvement is sort of like a disease vector or a violence vector that makes homicide more or less likely. And pair that up with that same inverted triangle pipeline to see if before you observe that drop in Sao Paulo, there was some different proportion or different way of handling homicide cases. Because zooming out, what guides me to grapple with that question is, it would seem as though boosting the integrity of the investigative process on the police side, when you have police corruption, you have a stakeholder group. It's like, why would we want more transparency or efficiency in accounting for something that is a currency that we also use, which is homicide, sort of instrumental homicide. So I'm curious if you know, in your view and your expertise in this area and in the Sao Paulo case, if you think that would be a worthy kind of question to entertain or explore.
I'm not sure if well, in the case of São Paulo, the state violence that you say that homicide is committed by police, I think like this decreased a lot in São Paulo. It's increased in the last year, but this decreased a lot. It's different for the case of Rio de Janeiro. 20% of the homicide that happens in Rio is by the police. It's a police killing, 20%. If you stop the police to kill, you can decrease in 20% of the crime. And this happens in some other states. Pernambuco also, they arrested a gang of police officers that make extrajudicial killings, and they decrease almost 30% of the homicide in the case of Pernambuco. Just arresting some people, they are high prolific murders. No? But this doesn't happen in São Paulo. One of the reasons that of this long decrease is that in the 90s, the military police were filmed executing some guy, and this become a motive for a lot of complaints, distrust, and the government began a process to reform internally the military police. Especially regard, for example, they were training using the Giraldi strategy to make stop and freeze. Giraldi is a method, so well, everybody knows. No? It's a method in how to stop and freeze the people, and this is one of the reasons that police began to kill less. They were training to use non-lethal weapons and things. I think that the case of São Paulo is really impressive. I don't think that have nothing to do with some kind of statistics that were manipulated, because the statistics, we use the statistics by the health system, not by the security system. We have a different source to work, and all of them shows the same tendency, and it happens in all the 400 cities in the state of São Paulo.
Thank you. We're going to take a brief 5-10 minute break, and then we're going to come back to our last session, and then we're going to have some closing remarks by Dr. Maguire. But this next session is going to be a little bit more participatory, a little bit different. We're going to experiment with a different strategy that I'm going to ask for a little bit of audience participation in providing some deterrence. And I'll explain what that means just in a bit. But we'll see you back here in about 5 or 10 minutes. Thanks. With H, who did the analysis. And what we did was we took a look at all the LAPOP data, and we just want to look at 2 issues. This is a forthgoing or ongoing paper that we're developing, looking at the relationship between the presence of gangs and victimization within countries. So we took the LAPOP data, which is nationally representative data, survey data, and you will see here in terms of the presence of gangs affecting neighborhoods, according to citizens, that things look a little bit different than I would have expected. You see, South America is fairly high with the number of residents, or the proportion of residents stating that there is a gang problem in their communities, and it goes down, and you see the Caribbean down there. Now that's a little bit different than what we know in terms of being on the ground there. We think that that might be related to pockets of gangs versus gangs being widespread throughout a country. This is victimization. We see some fairly similar trends with high rates of victimization in South America, and as you move down, rates of victimization are getting lower, with St. Kitts being the lowest in Antigua and Barbuda. And then we look at the intersection, the proportion of those victimized within a 12-month period, with the proportion stating that they have a gang problem within their community. Panama is a clear outlier, but you can see these same trends with the Caribbean down being in the lower quadrant, left quadrant, South America, Central America being in the upper right quadrant. We looked at the correlation there. There was actually a fair amount of power with gangs being significantly associated with victimization, albeit not as high as we would have expected. So the nature of our paper is going to be moving on and looking at what other factors in addition to gangs are associated with victimization and how much of a contribution gangs are making. But we do know that it's significant. It accounts for about 15% of the variance explained initially, but it's not necessarily more than that. And we'll be looking into it a little bit further as we move on. We'll take questions at the end because we're going to gong people out. Okay, and we'll come back to each one of these. The idea is that write your questions down and we'll go through it.
All right, Chuck and I have been working on a paper, working with another graduate student to look at homicides in Trinidad and Tobago. Right, so we talked a lot yesterday about how a lot of the theories and understanding of violence comes from places that are not from the Caribbean, right? So we looked at the 66 different police districts in Trinidad and Tobago, combined homicide data with census data to look at, and gang data from the police department, to look at community level factors and the presence of gangs and how that was contributing to increases or decreases in the number of homicides. One of the interesting things from this paper, I think, is that we found two different distinct types of disadvantage. I think as we finish up this paper, we're going to revisit what we're calling those, but we call them traditional disadvantage and another social disadvantage. And so some of the theories that have been developed right from Chicago and different things of concentrated disadvantage, I think we need to understand how that might be different in the Caribbean, how there's different social factors that are contributing to crime that are not the same as they are in America, right? The main finding here, I said I could probably do this presentation in one sentence, is that the more gangs and gang members you have in a police district, the more homicides you have, right? Not rocket science, but we're building some empirical evidence of that relationship. Right, we were able to calculate some of the numbers, right? For a police precinct or police district, 100 extra gang members resulted in about a 50% increase in homicides. 10 more gangs in a police district resulted in about a 140% increase in homicides. And so we can start to quantify what that relationship looks like. Some caveats, right? This is gang data by law enforcement. We need to better understand the accuracy and validity and reliability of that data that's being collected. This is just from one country, from Trinidad and Tobago. We're starting to identify that relationship, between community level factors, gang membership, and violence, and start to identify, continue to identify the risk and protective factors related to increased rates of gang membership that could be interrupted, much like some of the stuff that was being presented yesterday. Further addressing some of those factors, we can have an impact on violence. And I really think this issue of what are the unique types of concentrated disadvantage in the Caribbean that might vary by island, but we need to understand those factors better kind of at a macro level and how they contribute to violence. No gong for me.
I'm not next, it's Ed.
Thank you. So for the past several years, I've been involved in a process and impact evaluation of a program called Cure Violence as implemented in Trinidad and Tobago. This is an initiative that was developed in Chicago. And actually the research evidence on this initiative elsewhere is very mixed. We have clear instances in some cases of it working. We have a lot of instances of it having no effect. And we have some instances of what criminologists call an iatrogenic effect. It's a fancy word that just says crime went up when it was supposed to go down. Okay. So we have been involved in research in Trinidad and Tobago in various capacities since 2004. This is a quote from a paper we did in our initial diagnosis of what was happening with Trinidad and Tobago's homicide problem at the time. And what we found was that the massive increases in homicide in Trinidad and Tobago were due largely to gang violence carried out by and against young men, primarily of African descent, using guns. That was sort of the one-line summary from our initial diagnostic research going back about a decade. Those issues have not changed. This is still what's happening in Trinidad and Tobago. The government sent people to visit Chicago to look at cure violence, and over a number of years ended up deciding to adopt the program. They gave it the name Project Reason, which here's the acronym here. What you see in the photograph are two of the outreach workers. These are former offenders who have deep connections in the most crime-ridden communities. They wear these light blue shirts that have the Project Reason logos on them. Here you have Injun and Strongy. Strongy's a big, strong, muscular guy, so he got that nickname. So these guys are out there doing heroic work, attempting to mediate, forestall violence when they hear that it's going to occur, and they really did some amazing stuff. We're not done with our impact evaluation yet. We're still analyzing the data, but what I'm going to report are two findings that are now complete. We have two more data sets to analyze before we turn in our final report. So this is hot off the presses. The first one is, this was originally supposed to be a randomized trial. By the time we arrived on scene as the evaluators, that was no longer possible because the communities had already been selected. As is often the case, the communities they selected were among the most violent in the country. There are some other violent communities that were not selected, but by and large, these were among the most violent, which makes it really difficult to do a high-quality impact evaluation. We stumbled around with a few different methods and ultimately settled on something called a synthetic controls design. I won't get into the ugly details of what a synthetic controls design is, but basically what we found as a result of this approach is that Project Reason was associated with a significant drop in violence in the treatment area relative to the synthetic control area. That's research methodology I won't get into. A second data set, and this one is particularly exciting for me, there have been many attempts over the past 2 decades to develop violence observatories, and particularly to gather homicide data related to violence. We've heard some of our other speakers, Ted Lawrence mentioned having to go collect data from paper-based sources. We wanted to gather data on gunshot or admissions to emergency rooms for gunshot wounds. It took us several years to do it. Thanks to the Ministry of Health and to a woman at the Ministry of Health who was sort of my hero, who personally escorted us to 5 hospitals in Trinidad and Tobago, where I literally just dropped off teams of research assistants who went through paper-based records. We now have 8 years of gunshot wound admission data from 5 hospitals. 2 of those hospitals were using the data in this for this analysis. In Port of Spain General Hospital, the area served by Project Reason, we saw a significant drop, about a 45% drop in, yes ma'am, I'm done. We saw a significant drop in the hospital where Project Reason exists. We did not see a significant drop in a hospital that is located elsewhere in the country. So far, based on these 2, we conclude that this program is effective. Thank you for my time. Senor, where's him?
Anthony's up. There's no slides with his.
Yeah. Okay.
So briefly, I'm going to comment on what I would like to see on our research agenda. The first thing is I would like to see a lot more work done on the policy environment in the region, or environments. A brief word on why. We are all for evidence-based policy. That's what this entire seminar is about. And then you do this really great work, and it collides with politics, right? And a lot of irrationalities. So the issue is, if we are going to get the desired outcome of better policy, we have to understand that policy environment a little better. And the way to do it is to bring on our research agendas the study of, if you wish, public opinion, right? The lack of data sets are a huge resource that would allow for better understandings of these things. And therefore, a lot of investment is not required to gather new data and so forth, simply to begin to analyze these things a lot better. So that is really number one. Number two, I believe we need to do a lot more work on police reform, police transformation. Because in countries where the levels of violence are extraordinarily high and so forth, all of that discussion about why the declines in homicide and so forth, I believe in these conditions it's important to understand what's going on with law enforcement. Right? That's a huge kind of historical project to bring about better, more effective, more just policing in the region. It's important. In my opinion, a lot of the other things that are reported here are not going to work effectively without getting that element right. So those are the two things that I would emphasize.
Did I go in the wrong direction? It looks like I did. All right. So this project is a project that was funded by USAID in a project that we worked in collaboration with FUSADES, which is the Fundación Salvadoreña. I wrote it down because I am awful at acronyms. So, para el desarrollo económico y social. This is a project that Chuck and Vincent and I have been working on for a while now. The main objective of the project was to, the main objective of the project was essentially to understand the association between exposure to risk and protective factors and overall delinquency, and in turn inform policymakers regarding, some of the policies that could be implemented to address these issues. We followed a theoretical framework that's been widely used, the social development model, Hawkins and Catalano. Some of you in here are familiar with that work. And we assess peer, individual, family, school, and community level risk factors. Data were collected. It was a nationwide survey, and youth from 6th and 9th grade in 81 schools across El Salvador were surveyed for this project. We ended up with about close to 9,000 surveys. However, we only include in this analysis about 6,300, close to 6,300. And the reason for that was missing data patterns. There were some measures that we used to address whether they were being honest with their responses. So we omitted some of those cases. We focused on three main research questions, or that's sort of what we're focusing on in terms for the report in general, but the publications as well. We looked at gang involvement, gun involvement, and general crime and delinquency. There are different measures that go into each one of them. We can certainly discuss those afterwards. And then now Dr. Webb is going to tell you the findings. Sir?
Well, I'm going to try to let Lidia set the record for the shortest presentation. And before I really get going, I want to protest the fact that the boss gets to make all the rules. 4 minutes. Anyway, and the other thing is, one of the oldest guys in the room, I want you to know that I'm taking advantage of modern technology and I'm turning my timer on. Anyway, so we looked at 30 different covariates, 30 risk factors, and we're going to go through those pretty rapidly. I don't want to go through each other, through every one by any stretch of imagination. But we found in those domains, community, family, peer, individual, significant risk factors in terms of all three of our outcome variables. That is gang involvement, gun involvement, and crime involvement as well. We can get you the report, and you can look at those in great detail. But there's something that's not up here that I want to talk about, because Robin yesterday mentioned the importance of looking at proactive factors, which we don't have a slide on. And so what we wanted to do is just do a summary of some of the proactive factors. And I think the important part of this is that we also looked at the cumulative effect both of risk and protective factors. And let me just give you a couple of examples. So when the number of elevated risk factors was between 0 and 3, only about 4.7% of our respondents reported being gang involved. When we had 10 or more risk factors, we had about 40% of our respondents reported being gang involved. On the other side of the equation, when there were only between 0 and 2 protective factors, we had about 26% involved. If there were 5 or more protective factors, only about 13%. So I think that, you know, strong evidence for what you're trying to do in both Honduras and in the Caribbean in terms of addressing different levels of risk and programming based on different levels as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, darn it, I put 41 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm okay. Morning, everybody. Kenneth Sebastian here, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to have learned a lot during this conference and share some highlights and some themes from a project that some in the room will find extremely familiar because your names and fingerprints, figuratively speaking, are all over it. So the PIs on this project secured the grant in 2013. It's an NIJ-funded study, and given our time restrictions, the research design boils down to this sort of easy-to-remember number, 43221. That is 4 years, data collection 2014 through 2017, 3 research sites, greater Washington metropolitan area, so the DMV, DC, Maryland, Virginia, Los Angeles, and San Salvador in El Salvador. 2 populations of interest, gang members and gang experts, so law enforcement and self-identifying and alleged or identified MS-13 members. 2 instruments, a survey instrument inspired by or informed by Dr. Decker and the Eurogang's work. Some of the instruments were guided by that, which was a semi-structured interview and a survey instrument. And to complete it, because you're going down, the one is kind of optional, not really serious, but one heck of a challenge and learning opportunities. So that's the research design. And the 2 major themes that I'd like to focus on are really, surprise, surprise, the current federal, to be specific, the Trump administration's orientation to MS-13 is a little bit out of sync with the empirical findings that we are sort of combing through. And number 2, this is, there's some caveats to this type of claim, but basically kind of zooming out and thinking about community policing, problem-oriented policing, procedural justice in this sort of crimmigration, MS-13 gang enforcement context. So in one of the manuscripts that we have going, the only thing that I'll briefly comment on is it depends on your perspective, right? If you authored this in the 1990s, it's a good thing. If you are a decent human being, perhaps it's a bad thing that this has, some of these findings here have aged well, or quote unquote aged well, which is that if we were to try to understand what anti-immigration sentiment looks like, Calavita and Lipset articulate that it's that fear and hatred of foreigners and racial minorities, along with unbridled nationalism, tend to correlate with marked social or economic conflict. And in connecting this to Jonathan Simon at Berkeley Law, this concept of governing through crime, that's really that the executive branches at the gubernatorial levels and at the federal level often define their very platforms, their very modes of governance in crime-related discourse. But anyway, moving forward, the second theme is kind of zooming out and seeing to what extent do well-trodden principles and paths in criminology and criminal justice apply or perhaps fail to apply in the MS-13 context specifically. And in the discussion of policing models, we understand the role of sort of empirically evaluating potential pathways of displacement, right? There is, you can check the status of it now, nothing has changed here, but HR 3697, the Criminal Alien Gang Removal Act, kind of reminds reminds us that MS-13 today and historically is really a U.S. export. MS-13 is not some foreign entity infiltrating the U.S., but its genesis was actually part of a larger process that, if we take the long view, the Salvadoran Civil War didn't just happen, it didn't just randomly occur, and the refugee crises that it prompted of people fleeing violence also was something that didn't just randomly sort of occur with United States policy being sort of neutral in that process, but I digress. These cases are almost gross incompetence, so it's like gang expert as defined by what, and is this really the front line of MS-13 sort of response? And then you have the other end of the spectrum where there's sort of better oiled sort of operations in how you generate MS-13 related gang intelligence at the local law enforcement level. So I'm not sure if I'm directly tackling your question, but part of the IRB protocol is, of course, to protect all participants and stakeholders because it is such privileged access type of data, and to make sure that we don't create any liabilities for our partners in the project.
And I can tell you what the public's response has been to our findings. I've been receiving death threats and messages such as, "I hope you get raped by one of them," because, I mean, pretty heinous stuff. I mean, given
Explain the context.
Yeah, given I did put a symposium. There were some press releases. I've been approached a lot by the media because it's a unique study, right? We had this event. We invited local law enforcement. It was a team that collaborated this project, and I led the data collection efforts in the LA area. We thought it would be useful to sort of bring together all the stakeholders that worked with us on this and sort of like let them know, hey, this is what's going on, by the way, this is what DC looks like, this is what El Salvador looks like. I'm in Orange County, California. If anybody of you know, it's like a very high socioeconomic status, very homogeneous when it comes to race, predominantly white. They didn't like what I had to say, so it was pretty unfortunate. I mean, Chuck said you should frame those. That's so cool. But yeah, so kind of dealing with that right now. In terms of your other question, we actually, let me see. One more. So right here you can see sort of right under the outcome variable, gang involvement. That is all the questions. So if they said yes to any of those. So that's how we operationalize that.
So just one of those would count.
Mm-hmm.
So on this issue of risk factors and policy, I want to understand how best you translate research on risk factors into policy. So if it's established by this research that these risk factors are correlated with criminogenic outcomes, what is the policy conclusion for that? Because one of the things that concerns me is, okay, we've discovered an association, but it may be that, and what I would expect is that of those people who report those risk factors, a very small fraction of them actually go out and commit crimes and commit violence. And so what I worry about, and I worry about this with the public health approach generally, is that we are creating this conclusion that creates this constant sort of idea that we need to be everywhere all the time with everyone. And that is tremendously inefficient for policy. And so how can we make sure that, is that the case for the policy conclusions for risk assessment? And if so, how do we address it?
Well, first of all, this was really our first cut at even thinking through this issue in El Salvador. In Central America, there's not been a lot of this work done. And the work that has been done has been correlational. It has not been longitudinal. But Creative Associates, who we're working with on this project, is working away on it. And they are, we're working with them in a couple of locations to look at some of these issues longitudinally. to be able to look at it. But your question is right on. This is a question of just where basic research is needed to understand not just with respect to risk factors associated with delinquency and criminality, but also risk factors being associated with other problem behaviors, right? And we have problems with STDs, childhood pregnancy, or youth pregnancy, early marriage. We could go on.
Right, and this is really not a question limited. This is a question about the U.S. literature, in a lot of different areas that I have about how I find risk factors to be a tremendously valuable descriptive tool. It is not always that valuable to me as a policy, and I'd like to understand the disconnect.
Well, part of it, yeah, I mean, I understand what you're saying. Our problem is that we don't have widespread acceptance in terms of data, I believe, in terms of using data to identify potential problems that come along with it. So we end up focusing our research efforts on these small populations who are already at risk for a number of problems. In the ways that we've dealt with it in the public health field has been much more, has not been as judicious, let's say. It has been much more egalitarian. We have all kids are screened for hearing, for eyes, for scoliosis, and we go through these health checks within schools at certain age groups. I have no doubt that we're coming of age in the United States where we're going to be starting to do mental health checks and risk factors associated with it to catch these issues at an early age. It's coming. It's a question of when. And if the risk factors approach is going to be successful, we're going to have a better understanding of what it looks like in terms of a representative population, which we don't have. So until we get that kind of ability to generalize and understand the risk factors and how they impact the general population along those who are more at risk, I don't think we know the answer to it, to your question, quite frankly. I think it's still about to move. Guillermo's given this a lot of thought, and I'll turn this over to him.
Well, I have given that a lot of thought. I don't really have it's still at the thinking stage, and so I'll let you handle that one. I really wanted to get back to this because I wanted to know if being a member but wanting to leave, being a former member, being friend of a gang member, and current friends in a gang, if those things got equal rating. And the reason I ask that is because the government of El Salvador maintains that there are 60,000 gang members in El Salvador. And and that figure, what they say publicly all the time, affects a network of 400,000 people. So if I live in a neighborhood, if I live in Mexicanos or in Chacras or whatever, I will have friends that are in a gang. Everybody in that community will have friends that is in a gang. Chacras is a gang neighborhood. Soyapango is a gang neighborhood. So anybody that lives there is going to have friends that is in a gang. So I'm questioning whether each one of those things got an equal rating, because if this is how the government of El Salvador arrived at that figure, it's not, so I'm not questioning your research, I'm trying to understand, do all those things get equal rating? Because if I live in the jungles in the LA, my friends will be in a gang. I live in the zip code 90008. That means that's like the largest, everybody has friends that is a gang member. So how do we discriminate? Or is that an association, an affiliation? Because I could see this could be a little bit problematic.
Well, it's not here. I completely agree, and that's some good news, right? Because that means that number, that 20%, right? It's not every single one of them is actually. You handed it to me and I still didn't use it. I don't follow directions really well. Yeah, so that means that's good news, right? Because then that means that 20% is like none of them, not every single one of them is actually getting involved. It's just this affiliation. But we struggled quite a bit as well when we were trying to figure this out. Because, we're coming at it from this idea of sort of like preventative efforts. So we're trying to address risk factors, right? So we also wanted to see those kids that have friends because they're sort of on that pipeline, right? So we wanted to, that's why we didn't call it gang membership. We called it gang involvement. You were saying something.
Well, we have actually, I think
I think this gets at your point to a certain extent, and I don't have it in front of me, but we find differences between the kids in our survey that were in urban settings versus rural settings, for example. We don't really have any kind of measure of the pervasiveness of a gang in their neighborhood or anything like that, and I think that's an important point. But to go to your point, I mean, when I first started getting involved in this stuff back in the early 90s, when, you know, the public health model was coming in and risk factors were, you know, being talked about a lot, so on and so forth. I got to thinking about this in terms of, I keep going back to just a health model, and that is that one of the reasons for looking at these different factors and the cumulative effect is that, you know, if we're going to prevent, you know, a heart attack, and we've got, you know, this many risk factors, or we've only got one risk factor, I think we approach what we ought to do quite differently. And so I think that's the importance of not just worrying about people at the top who've got the, you know, highest risk, but to start with, you know, you're healthy, you run, you have a good diet, but your father died of a heart attack. So here's, you know, what you ought to be doing or not doing.
May I comment to the question?
So in our instruments, we tackle this sort of head on because the very definition of a gang is, as some of us are familiar with, is problematic and sort of imperfect at best, right? So you use the definition that best suits the needs of the project. But the emphasis on alleged versus or as opposed to self-identifying gang members is critically important. And because we have a fragmented, decentralized CJ system, one Virginia jurisdiction, that county jail, will have a fundamentally different process and a fundamentally different caliber or quality of gang identification practices than another. And so you have different sources of selection bias that we keep an eye out for, because those who self-identify, it's like your objective sort of gang members that you have, like video evidence, previous case evidence, you have their rap sheet and all that, they may or may not, and in many cases in interviewing in correctional settings, will not openly acknowledge, or you have to talk about everything else but what the interview instrument sort of actually has. And then on the alleged bit, you also have cases where it's just 4 people were arrested, 1 person was MS-13, all 4 get tagged in the same way, and next thing you know, they're like pledges in a fraternity doing push-ups and sit-ups, you know, in the jail because they're kind of sucked in or lumped into this group. And so other parts too, it's like there was an experience where someone was
categorized between an association saying that people who are in gangs or people who have these risk factors are at an increased risk of joining a gang. Great. How much? That is an extremely important question, because I don't want, as a policymaker, it's going to be extremely different to deal with every single person who is at an elevated risk. And so that's a very important thing. And what I would speculate is that this problem, this criminal justice problem, is like almost every other criminal justice problem, in that it does not follow a normal distribution, it follows a power law distribution, and that a few people drive the overwhelming result number of the thing. And so it's not enough to say that it's an increased risk. We need to know how much risk. The second disconnect is the disconnect between gang membership and violence, because ultimately we wouldn't even care about gangs if they weren't associated with violence. And what we find from Scott and from other people is that gangs and gang members are not monolithic. So even if someone is in a gang, I don't necessarily care if my main issue is serious violence. They may just be the gang's weed dealer. And so, you know, I worry that you're sort of so focused on this issue of the gang and not on the ultimate behavior. And one of the things I think we should ask ourselves is, in all of this gang research, if we substituted the name violent offender, would we have a dramatically different result? And so I just think we need to really examine what we're doing in this area.
No, I worry too. That's why I'm doing this type of work. But
well,
just one reaction to that, and that is that I think if you look at a lot of the focused deterrence efforts, projects, that's exactly what they're doing. I mean, when we did our focused deterrence project in Phoenix, we were looking for the baddest of the bad. So we weren't, saying this is the gang, trying to deal with the whole gang. We were looking at members within a gang, and these are guys that are known to be bad to the police and so on and so forth.
And
that's
those interventions have the biggest results.
Yeah, and that's who we're going to call in and so on. So I agree. I mean, I think it's important. Still not. I mean, I still think it's important to carry out this line of research in order to see if we can get to the point where we can make some intelligent policy recommendations based on the level of risk. Before they become your bottom bidder. I haven't given up on that. In other words, I'd rather that than have to go through and say who's the baddest of the bad, and we're going to work on those guys and wait until they're bad.
Right, but my concern is that the policy implications for so much of this risk factor work, and you end up in this very attenuated primary prevention space, which the evidence is saying is not the biggest return on investment in terms of violence. Now, that's why I think that the YSET and the work in Honduras is so important, because it is one of the few areas where risk assessment is being used to narrow the scope. And we need to think more about it.
I share your discomfort. I have the same discomfort. I've spoken with Chuck about it, this issue of at what point, what is the ultimate value of identifying through a number of risk factors, who's at the highest risk of violence, specifically violence associated with group identity, which is as you know, it's a somewhat different kind of violence. However, I don't know if I have an answer for that. I think that I share your discomfort with it. I do agree that we need to continue this type of research around the issue of risk factors. And I think that, how we categorize gangs and gang crime, very, very, very tenuous. In LA, gang crime is identified by if, Thomas and I are in the Cal Gangs database and we have a fight over watermelon, it is a gang-related crime. It has nothing to do with advancing the gang. Just the fact that we're both in the Cal Gangs database, that goes down as a gang-related crime. It has nothing to do with the gang. Now, back to El Salvador, I'm extremely concerned with the situation in El Salvador because we currently have a civil war in El Salvador between the police and the gangs. And the numbers that are being thrown around are pretty scary, which justifies these actions of hit squads. And, El Salvador is probably right now the most difficult place in Central America in terms of how we're responding to the identity of a group of people, not necessarily the behavior. I guess we need to do more work to really get down to what the real numbers are. Because in El Salvador in particular, it's pretty scary. It's scarier in LA as well, by the way, because there has been a decrease in gang-related crime in LA, but I think gang membership is up. Allegedly. Both are allegedly. So, anyway, thank you for your work.
Just one last thing. I mean, would the conversation be different if what we were interested in is identifying, which we kind of are, identifying risk factors associated with becoming a victim?
That's a really good question.
That would be closer,
Yeah.
but again, my concern would be how much risk. And if you are able, and
When
if
you say how much risk, like what are you looking for, like a number? Are we looking for when you say how much risk, like?
These are all associated with odds ratios of risk.
So
right, but are you multiplying? Do you have a multiple of a very small risk? So that even when you multiply by, it's 5 times more risky, it's still incredibly small.
Which is the way public health is, right?
Right.
That's what public health does.
Right, but there's, but I think this, being a murderer is not the same as a heart attack, and the stigma of searching for murderers and saying you're at risk for being a murderer is a big difference, and we got to be careful about, I just think that given, there is so much fear-mongering and scaremongering about gangs. There's so many overbroad gang databases. There is so much hype around this that I just think we have to be very careful about things that sort of buy into that. And I think that we need to be skeptical of interventions and assessments that are not consistent with this power law, distribution, and that aren't consistent with Weisberg's crime concentration thesis and these types of things. Maybe those things are wrong. They can still be tested and examined. But it's just, I'd like to approach some of this stuff with a little more skepticism.
Can I just add real quick, and I understand where you're coming from, Thomas, but I have to say also that having been at AID and thinking back to 2010, we didn't have no discussions about risk differentiation. So the fact that there's actually this framework now in place we're having this discussion now is a huge leap forward. And I get that you want to get to a higher level of sophistication, but I wouldn't completely sort of negate here what's happening, because I think this is hugely important for the research, but also the allocation of funding in the field for better targeted programs to get at the higher risk groups. Because before, again, like I said yesterday, it was just 1,000 points of light programming. It was go in and do a community-based program without any idea of who you were actually servicing and whether those individuals were the ones who were going to actually go out and commit some kind of violent crime or act. And so this is, from a policymaker standpoint, this is critical stuff. And so,
but I'm also a former federal policymaker, and the one thing I would say is I don't want to be that patient in that I would not want to have a period of transition where a lot of money is spent, where we went from no risk differentiation to an incredibly simplistic differentiation before we got to a more narrow focus on tertiary and secondary risk.
I would just say to that you have to bring people along, and not everybody's at the same place as you are. You see
That's
that
true.
from being in the field, so that those are this is all part of that process.
To use Ed Maguire's, we're in the first layer of that onion. So.
Okay, we'll have one more question or comment, and then we're going to have Dr. Maguire have some closing remarks for us.
So the one thing I find very promising is the idea that there's interest in the longitudinal study. I grew up in Los Angeles at the time that MS-13 was beginning. And I got to tell you, back then, it was about territorialism. But the one thing I felt I had was a choice. Kids joined gangs because they felt a need to belong. And right now, we live in a society where a lot of kids are being made to feel like outcasts. The one thing that I find that has changed over time is that nowadays, I didn't have to worry back then about getting shot. Guns introduces another level of risk into this equation that I think is not being talked about enough. To the extent that these kids feel that they have a choice of joining or not joining, that's another thing. And then the other idea that's been tossed around is this difference about whether the concern should be reducing gang membership or reducing violence. Because there may be a correlation, but not necessarily causation. I mean, kids don't necessarily join gangs because they want to commit crimes.
Correct.
So.
Thank you. Dr. Maguire is going to have the last words at our meeting. Before we do that, I want to thank everybody for attending. I know everybody has extremely busy schedules. We really appreciate you coming out. And we're going to see most of you here at about, where'd Jonathan go?
2:45.
Jonathan, 2:45 in front of the hotel for some of the special guests who are going to be joining us for a little bit of an outing up north. But I do want to thank everybody. I'm going to be here after the talk. Would love to chat with some of you, and I hope that we can continue this conversation in the forthcoming months. So thank you all for coming, and with that I'm going to leave it over to Dr. Maguire to close things out.